Okay, since most of us are here, I think we can start our session today. Well, good morning, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and welcome to another week of site planning. This week we might have Frendika join us for this session. He hasn't he said that he would like to join today, but he hasn't given any further confirmation whatsoever. But we'll see. He might just pop up as we as the class continues, um, or sometime during the class. Okay, so picking up where we left off last week, we talked about the the physical, and touched on a little bit of the cultural aspects of site planning, or to be precise, site inventory. This week we'll focus more on the biological and we'll go a little deeper into the cultural aspects of a site. Before we move on next week to site analysis and or a site inventory exercise. Okay, so I think as we all know, more than half of the world's population is now living in urban areas, and in Indonesia's case, I think it's about 50 to 60% of the Indonesian population living in urban areas. And to accommodate the ever-growing urban population, millions and millions of acres of forests, wetlands, and grasslands were converted into built areas, converted into urban, suburban, and exurban development. Now, this type of expansion, expansion is unprecedented, and most of it paid relatively little attention to its sustainability. The expansion eradicated countless habitats, and they also fragmented natural corridors that link terrestrial and aquatic habitats. And because of this habitat loss and fragmentation, ecosystems today are very much more isolated from each other and less buffered from both human and non-human disturbances. One thing we need to keep in mind when we talk about the biological aspects of site inventory is that ecosystems have both biotic and abiotic components, and the ecological structure and function of landscapes are influenced by the complex interplay of biological, physical, and cultural systems. So, in essence, everything that you list in your site inventory, they have a more or less they interplay, or they interact with each other, more or less so. When we talk about landscape ecology is a transdisciplinary science. It's a science that concerns itself with landscape structure, landscape function, and landscape change. Now, both basic and applied research in landscape ecology can help inform more context-sensitive land use planning at regional, community, and even site scales. Now, why is the biological aspect important? Well, we now know and we now understand that, for example, when you build a new road in a formerly forested landscape, they can be barriers to lateral movement of ground-dwelling animals. Excuse me. Here you go, buddy. Sorry about that. We're talking about lateral movement of animals. Okay, so if you build a road in a naturally forested landscape, if you build a road through the forest, then you will introduce barriers of movement to ground-dwelling animals. The tree-dwelling ones may be okay because they could still, or they will be affected, but they may not be affected as much as the ground dwellers. You may also isolate endemic species and perhaps even dooming those species to extinction at the local level, not at the global scale, but at the local level, and well, possibly at even broader spatial scales. So conversely, if you build a road through previously undisturbed forests or other fragmented natural areas, these roads can serve as linear conduits for pathogens and invasive exotic species. So that just goes to show that site inventory, although it seems as if it is a tedious part of the site planning and design process, but it is very important. It allows us to understand. It allows us to understand the environmental context, and it gives us a holistic picture of what we are dealing with. And I know that in your group task, the site that you will choose will be considered as an empty site. But however, you still need to consider it is empty site, empty as in you don't need to consider relocating or modifying existing functions, existing built functions. However, you still need to consider the physical, the biological, and the cultural aspects of your site. Most of the times, planners, designers don't have a blank canvas to work with, so this site inventory process is not only relevant for site planning, but it is also relevant to any other activity, any other planning activity that has anything to do with the natural environment, and the built environment. Okay, so let's poodle on. Oh, I forgot to put the last couple of points down in here, but we'll pick up this week. We're picking up from what we were talking about last week. So we'll talk more about nature's infrastructure. We'll talk about ecological communities, habitats and niches, and invasive species, wetlands, wildlife, and plants. We'll also be talking about the cultural aspects of the site inventory process, highlighting specifically things like neighborhood typology, neighborhood character, visual quality, and the like. Okay, I see Badewa has already joined us. Welcome to the session and happy listening. Right, so nature's infrastructure. What we mean with by nature's infrastructure is basically the air, the water, soils, plants, animals, and even microbes that, if you put them together in one ecosystem, they provide many of the goods and services we need to survive on this planet. We all know that trees remove carbon dioxide and add oxygen to the air we breathe through photosynthesis. In other words, we're actually breathing in vegetation farts. Soils, which are teeming with microorganisms, help detoxify pollutants in stormwater runoff. And just the other day, I learned of what was it? Microbes deep down near the ocean bed, where these microbes feed on methane, and they help control the level of methane in the water so that it doesn't escape and poison the air that we breathe. So, but there are limits to the amount of pollution in the environment in any given location that can be absorbed by these natural filters or natural infrastructures. There's a capacity, and if they're overwhelmed, then these ecosystem infrastructure or ecosystem services can strike an unbalance, and thus reducing their capacity to perform their duties, thus impairing the environmental and of course our health. Many conventionally designed built environments result in off-site environmental impacts. Such as contaminant-laden stormwater runoff from parking lots and other impervious surfaces. Climate change, of course, increases the risks of this business as usual approach. And this business as usual approach is a very resource consumptive approach to development. Many conventional land use practices not only endanger or imperil environmental quality, but also the general community livability. So that's why it is increasingly important for us today to observe the balance between the built and the natural environment, and we're still learning how to get along with Mother Nature. So what is an ecological community? An ecological community is an aggregation of interacting species living together in the same place. Complex interactions among the climate, soil, topography, disturbances, and other other organisms influence the composition and the spatial distribution of maybe communities. Now, these communities are often named for the dominant plant species, which may be dominant because of its physical size or because of its abundance. The first thing that comes to my mind when I look at this, when I hear this definition, that consider the dominant plant species, either because of their population, because of the number, or because of their size. The first, if we keep that in mind, then the first ecological community that comes to my mind is stuff like pine forests, or kalau di sini hutan jati. It's full of jati. I don't know. Does anybody here know of any local ecological communities? Too early. That's okay. And then I'd like to introduce you to a term called landscape pattern. That is the spatial arrangement of habitat patches and corridors, along with the intervening land uses and land covers, that strongly influences biodiversity and other indicators of ecosystem health. There's ecotones, ecotones, or the spatial boundaries of ecological communities that are especially important areas biologically. Animals can find shelter, protection in one ecotone, but they would seek food in another habitat. So that's just an illustration of ecological communities. And speaking of habitat, the expanding or the expansion of the built environment has dramatically altered the structure and ecological function of landscapes worldwide. And one of the problems that it's caused is habitat fragmentation. Now, habitat fragmentation is a global problem that can be mitigated through the coordinated reintroduction of green infrastructure. Just by planting trees and gradually increasing a community's tree canopy. The negative impacts of habitat loss and impervious surfaces can be mitigated. Planting trees is considered to be a stormwater best management practice. Land use changes will often impact habitat structure or habitat patterns, habitat size, and habitat connectivity. Those sort of things. And landscapes are a kind of dynamic mosaic consisting of patches or like woodlots or bushes, patches and corridors like streams, rivers, and sometimes a larger, more extensive matrix. Like if you talk about a cropland, then that's an interaction of different woodlots or woodlands or bushes and streams and whatnot. Natural environment corridors allow the movement of organisms between habitats on daily and seasonal timescales. Now, these corridors also enable species to migrate over longer temporal and spatial scales. So, if you identify these patterns in your site, then these gaps in environmental corridors can be targets for restoration. Habitat connectivity is an important function of regional open space systems, particularly in the context of climate change, which is altering the geographic range of countless species of plants and animals. Riparian areas and wetlands, they serve important hydrologic functions in addition to their ecological benefits, which include biodiversity. And these natural areas are also they also provide recreational opportunities, aesthetic amenities, and outdoor living laboratories for natural science education. So it is worth your while to keep natural habitats. And another consideration to leave natural areas untouched. Sometimes simply leaving them untouched may not be enough to ensure their ecological health. For example, that seems like a nice patch of woods over there on our site. There seems to several species of plants and animals seem to live there. They live there, and let's just not touch that, but we'll modify the rest of the site heavily. So leaving a patch of land untouched may not be enough to ensure their ecological health, because, as you know, everything is connected. Many forest bird species, for example, require habitats in very large in large forest patches, and these interior forest habitats are buffered from predators and from microclimatic fluctuations that are more common with forest edge habitats. Although maybe the fluctuations in here in our country is not that extreme, but just imagine if you were imagine yourselves developing a site in a four seasons area. Then that's where the microclimatic fluctuations are pretty extreme, can be pretty extreme. Many animal species also need more than one habitat type for their different life cycle stages, such as for reproduction and migration. I just talked about habitat, but haven't touched on niches. So niche, this illustrates what a niche may be. So consider, or just imagine a community of pine trees or pine tree forest, and of course, the forest is a habitat for many different species of birds. And then if you look at one tree can be a niche for one tree can be a habitat for multiple species, multiple bird species or lizard species or insects. In this case, it's the warbler. There are three types of warblers that live or that consider a pine tree home. However, these three different warblers live they live in different sections of the tree. The yellow rump warbler, they feed off the flower in the low. They feed off the lower part of the tree, at the bases of the and the bases of the middle branches, and then up in the mid section we have the bay-breasted warbler. Sorry, it's not a habitat. They don't live on the tree. They feed off the tree. And the Cape May warbler feed off the upper part or the top part of the tree. Now these feeding locations, or they may live there as well, but these different locations or these different containers of activities are then known as niches. It may be a little harder to spot, or it may require a little more or much more effort to spot niches, because then you may have to hold, or you may have to conduct a longer term observation. Okay, I talked about building a road through a forest and how that would introduce invasive species to the forest. Now, invasive species are not only animal species. Some plant species may also be considered as invasive. For millennia, plant and animal species have been adapting to habitats altered by human activities. Centuries of global trade, migration, settlement have introduced thousands and thousands of non-native species to new environments. Now these exotic and sometimes or if most of the times invasive species no. Okay, so let's stop at the global trade, migration, and settlement thing, and how that introduces invasive species. Rabbits rabbits are one rabbits is one invasive species I know to Australia. The European settlers took rabbits with them on their ships for protein sources, food. And then when they struck land, they released the rabbits. And rabbits, as you know, they can multiply very quickly, and thus overrunning and they, since they don't exactly have natural predators there. They were pretty much dominated and became pests up to a certain extent a greater part of Australia back a long time ago. Frogs, cane toads also they're also another invasive species there. I don't really know who brought them, or who introduced them to Australia, but cane toads were, or every now and then they become an issue. So the locals have dealt with cane toads once, and then they thought it's over, but then they pop up again, and they start wreaking havoc. Yeah. So exotic species or invasive species are particularly successful colonizers. If you come to think of it, they are like colonizers, aren't they? When the new habitat present minimal competitive controls that limit their growth and reproduction. Now, invasive species may be limited in their native habitats, however, by grazing in the case of plants or by predator in the case of animals. And this sort of competition for the same ecological niche helps hold in check the population of competing species. Yeah. What else was I about to say? Yeah. Oops, that went pretty fast. Okay. Next up, we have wetlands. Now, wetlands perform a number of functions that can directly benefit society. Coastal wetlands, for example, they're basically nursery grounds for shellfish and other commercial sport fish. Other species, such as migratory birds, depend on wetlands for food and for cover, shelter. Wetlands also serve as a natural retention area for stormwater runoff and are often locations of groundwater recharge. Ephemeral wetlands have soils that are saturated for a relatively brief period of time each year, or in more arid landscapes even less frequently. Although in the dry seasons these wetlands may appear to have very little ecological value, during the wetter periods there are critical habitats for many migratory bird species, and of course they are our buffer from saltwater intrusion and other harmful or other potentially harmful effects from the sea. Now there are different wetland classes. There's marine wetlands, there's estuaries, there's riverine, and last is the palustrine. That includes marshes, wet meadows, ferns, potholes, bogs, swamps, and small ponds. I think in some places there's a thing called wetland banking, and wetland banking is allowed in some jurisdictions to develop for the development of mitigation purposes, or sorry, for development mitigation purposes. This practice, the wetland banking, is an attempt to create new wetlands in anticipation that existing natural wetlands will be destroyed through land development. But I think some people have argued against wetland banking. I'm not sure. I need to look deeper into that. One of their arguments is that constructed wetlands typically develop far less biodiversity than indigenous wetlands, and that another problem with this practice involves the hydrologic context of both the eradicated and the newly created wetlands. And the loss or degradation of natural wetlands can alter local hydrologic regimes. They can increase flooding risk and diminish groundwater base flow into nearby streams and lakes. So if you happen to have a patch or a strip of wetlands in your site, that would present as a very unique case to highlight. Now, most wildlife species have a very spatially discontinuous population distribution. That is, that the entire species consists of spatially dispersed subpopulations, or also known as metapopulations. I mentioned something about development may cause extinction at a local scale. Now, local scale extinctions of these metapopulations is an inherent property of ecosystem dynamics. It will happen anyway, but development or human intervention may actually help accelerate them. Now, this natural process usually involves temporary local extinctions, followed by migration and colonization by members of other metapopulations. It is essential, however, that areas in which a local extinction occurs remains a viable habitat for that species' future colonization and repopulation. If the habitat is destroyed or degraded, or it may be kept natural, it may be healthy, but made inaccessible by intervening barriers, then the geographic range of the species is permanently reduced. Now, I am one for the idea of building something or building environments that are that consider the coexistence of both humans and animals and plants species. You could do that by introducing wooded patches and maybe stream corridors within suburban or urban and rural landscapes. Now, these wooded patches can become home to colonies of birds and other animal species assemblages. Now, I just like them. I just like them because it's fun to see. It's fun to see pigeons roam around the city. They can be a bit of a pest, though, but it's fun, and I absolutely adore barn owls and the like. This isn't exactly a photo of a barn owl, though, but you get the idea. So, but conserving, however, as much as I like that, that's my personal take on it. But conserving wildlife habitats within the built environment does have benefits for meta communities, or local communities of multiple interacting species. Many bird and bat species, for example, are prolific consumers of insects that are pests to food crops and people. Birds also have significant aesthetic value for avid bird watchers and casual observers alike. Um, the kookaburra, for example, is a natural morning alarm. They will they will start to sing or shout, scream, however you call it, around 4 or 5 in the morning, and get 100 of them in a wooded patch near your house, and you get yourself a really nice natural clock. Um, Possums are another thing. Possums are like, well, they're cute, but they can bite, scratch you, and give you rabies. Um, but they also leave their waste everywhere. But still, yeah, it's still nice to have because they do remove other invasive species, small insects. I hate insects. A map showing spatial, if possible, if you do have different species on your site, a map that shows spatial distribution of known species, especially of known endangered and threatened species, can provide very useful contextual information. These maps typically show the geographic range where these species habitats and populations are likely to be present. The most effective method for protecting species, whether or not they're endangered and threatened, is to protect their natural habitats, of course. Consequently, when a proposed land development project threatens an endangered species, site distribution data for these species are typically acquired through field studies by qualified biologists. For the purpose of your task, you don't need to recruit a qualified biologist to do so. You just need to rely on your personal observation and perhaps a little help from Google Lens. Vegetation. Now, many communities recognize that trees are valuable natural resources that enhance the quality of life. It enhances the sense of place and property values. Municipal street tree inventories commonly record tree size, species, and location. So if you're conducting a site inventory, you may be able to get vegetation data from the local government. I think especially when I think the Department of Parks and Open Spaces have an inventory of the different species of plants and where they plant them, because we do have because in Surabaya we have several colorful boulevards and street mediums. So you may be able to get your hands on these inventories, but otherwise, again, you may need to conduct a site observation, a field observation, and observe. Increasingly common are municipal tree preservation ordinances that seek to protect trees throughout the development process. I'm not sure how our regulatory framework protects vegetation. I think normatively speaking, most if not all of our development regulations state that we need to conserve certain amount of green space. Although as to the best of my knowledge, I don't think they have a very detailed. They may not. I'm not saying I don't. I shouldn't say I don't think they have, but they may not have a very detailed requirements as to which which native species they need to conserve and which of these you can remove from site. But plants or vegetations, as we've established, is a critically important element in the built environment's overall green infrastructure. That trees can serve multiple design functions that directly benefit people and the environment. For example, trees can help clean the air and create habitat for insects and birds. Trees can also serve as windbreaks to provide shade and protection and reduce costs of actually having to build artificial shelters, artificial roofs. And if you don't have to build an artificial shelter or artificial roof, then you ultimately reduce the environmental impact of your development. And also you reduce the risk of you reduce the risk or you reduce the chances of generating heat islands, and you're also curbing the impacts of the heating and cooling of nearby buildings. So, and by doing so, or by moderating the microclimates near homes and other buildings, trees can reduce the energy demand for air conditioning. If you look at our campus, ITS, for example, it is arguably or can be considered as a pretty green environment. Our department with its overgrowth now looks like it's starting to look like an overgrown forest, which is good because it's just green. Green is such a nice color to look at, and it provides us with plenty of shade. Now, all we need to do is just remove those covers from the vent holes, and to let proper cross ventilation in, because we've gotten rid of the shade. We've gotten rid of the excess natural light. And I think we should be good to go, actually. Ramble. Trees also add significant aesthetic value by helping us screen or block undesirable views or spatially defining outdoor rooms. Trees also benefit public health by tempering, as I mentioned, the urban heat island effect, and green, as I said, green is such a nice color to look at because green can help decrease physical and emotional stress. Somehow, if our eyes see green, it's a lot less stressful as it is when seeing other colors. So they say. Now, as significant amenities, trees can increase the value of real estate by as much as 15%, depending on where you are. There is a grading or categorizing or a grading scale. There is a grading scale that the International Society of Arboriculture have identified, and The grading also describe the factors that affect the economic value of trees. So size-wise, you can grade trees according to size, according to species, according to its condition, and perhaps even its location. Size-wise, mature trees have greater value than the seedlings. In general, species that can easily adapt to different environmental conditions um, are more valuable. And condition, of course, healthy roots, healthy trunks, branches, and healthy leaves. They add value. And sometimes in some locations, a prominent species or a prominent specimen tree is of greater value than others. So the grading that the International Society of Arboriculture doesn't specifically state what size and how much, but it's more of a guideline, so to say. So context-sensitive planning, context-sensitive site development seek to integrate uh, or should seek to integrate, where possible, where feasible, significant existing trees and green spaces. Um, in assessing a site's biological attributes, data on tree species, tree size, condition, they're typically recorded, and of course their spatial distribution. Now, a key question to ask is, if there are significant trees on the site, is can these natural assets be incorporated within the development? So can you actually use these trees? Can you actually use can you use them um, to the best of your design or to the best of your development? Existing on-site trees require a certain degree of protection during the construction process, especially during the construction of buildings, utilities, and other circulatory systems. Um, Construction can damage or kill trees outright or lead them to a slow death. Typical construction impacts include soil compaction within the tree's root zone, um, grading activities like cutting or filling the soil to modify the slope and aspects can also damage the root zone area. They may also scrape the bark from the tree trunk and branches. Many tree species have a very fine mesh. Uh, they have a very fine mesh of roots within about 30 centimeters of soil. Now, so at the very least, construction disturbances shouldn't really occur beyond the shouldn't really occur. Sorry, it shouldn't really occur within the drip line zone of a tree's canopy. So if you see a tree, measure out its canopy. In practice, measure out its canopy, determine where the drip line zone is, and stay the hell away from developing directly underneath that tree. But moving on to the cultural and historic context. If previously we were talking about the tangible biological elements of a site, this time we'll be talking more, this time we'll talk about tangible and intangible aspects of a site, called cultural resources. So cultural resources, as you know, are tangible and intangible aspects of cultural systems, both past and present, that are valued by or representative of a given culture, or that contain information about a culture. Development that fits the site is responsive to the site's cultural and historical context. And by incorporating in the new development the design and styles and construction materials of indigenous to the region, um, site planners and architects can strengthen a community's sense of place. Some of these aspects you will learn of deeper when um, when you start the urban design when you start the urban design units. But I'll touch on them. I'll touch on them quickly in the over the following sections. So there are several. I think there are two. There are two things in this section in building a neighborhood character. Building a neighborhood character is defined by its morphology, its shape, and another one is by its typology. And when you talk about its morphology, um, one of the ways to understand a community character hinges on identifying its more one of it on its different attributes. Sorry. And one of the attributes is morphology. Kevin Lynch, in his seminal work, The Image of the City, developed a conceptual framework to assess the urban structure, or in his words, urban legibility or urban readability. And this elements of urban form also help to explain how people form mental maps or cognitive maps of the built environment. Cognitive maps, according to Lynch, they help us orient our way and navigate through or wayfinding in built environments. In built environments with a very strong sense of place. What is this? What does this keep doing that? Strong sense of place. And then the 5 elements of urban form are edges. Now, edges include shoreline, streets, and and perhaps even major changes in land use. So residential and commercial, where residential use ends and commercial begins, that's an edge. Paths, that's pretty self-explanatory. Streets and major walkways or bike paths. Districts, like neighborhood and major institutions. Nodes, entrances, transport hubs or terminals, intersections, plazas, public squares, and major walkway intersections, and of course landmarks. For example, buildings that are unique, bridges or natural features. And this conceptual framework is especially useful in assessing the character of the built environment in an area considered for redevelopment. You're not going to have to deal with the elements of urban form right now, but I'll just give you a brief introduction to it so that you get the idea when you join the urban design unit. Another way of understanding the building and neighborhood character through its morphology is to use a figure ground mapping. Using figure ground mapping, using figure ground mapping techniques, you can assess the texture or the grain of the built environment. It's quite simple. It only involves mapping two elements: the building footprints or the figures, dark patches, and the spaces in between the buildings, or the ground, which is the empty, or the white areas here. Now, the resulting map of solids and voids reveal the texture of the built environment, which can vary widely across a community, spatially from block to block and across time, from decade to decade. Suburban buildings, for example, are typically freestanding objects in space, in contrast to urban buildings, which are often connected and effective shapers of outdoor space. Figure ground diagrams are particularly useful for informing the design and siting of new buildings, for example, to determine a building's size, shape, and placement on the site. Evaluating the built environment's existing character can also help site planners design new or design context-sensitive new development. If the design quality near the site is good, then this context may be worth emulating. In some locations, however, the existing built environment can be pretty poorly designed, and so you may need to make major changes before you can actually site a new building in. Next is morphology. Now, an assessment of building character, for example, consider at least the facade width, the facade height, width, and proportion, proportions of windows and door openings, horizontal and vertical rhythms. A little bit on that, maybe some other time. Material, colors, shapes, and textures, roof form, signs and sidewalk coverings, and then, of course, a setback from the street. So this is just another way of assessing the the neighborhood character or the building character if you happen to be working with if you happen to be working with a partially developed canvas, or you're trying to restore a neighborhood. Now, why is the cultural context important? Because if you evaluate the site's cultural context, then you can benefit scratch that. Let's talk about typologies now. The typologies here may building a neighborhood character from the typological side here means that you can evaluate a site's cultural context based on character defining attributes, building height, building style, the year of its construction, or location within the urban to rural continuum. Building typology can also be based on uses. For example, residential, commercial, educational, religious, or perhaps even the typology according to sustainability practices. Water and energy efficiency. Is this a water efficient building? Is this an energy efficient building, and so on? Or renovation status, fully refurbished or high renovation potential. in an analysis of neighborhood attributes in somewhere in British Columbia in Canada, there's a typology of six neighborhood types spanned a continuum from rural to a more urban areas. Now, the typology that this study came up with included the following types of residential or multifunction types. I think single-family houses can also be found around here. Multifamily residential towers, we do have multi-family residential towers. Mixed-use residential commercial developments like Buko and perhaps even other typologies are existent. Now, neighborhood and building typologies can be documented on image boards. So instead of one way of creating an inventory of neighborhood character is to have a wall of image boards with or an image board with photographs and perhaps even a map with annotated street elevations and sections and maps that show the locations of representative buildings or neighborhoods within each type. Now, in addition to the influence of buildings, the character of the built environment is also influenced by the circulation system configurations, the land use combinations, the size, placement, and the design of outdoor open spaces, and also their construction materials. Regionally distinctive construction materials, perhaps the use of locally quarried stone, or in glaciated regions would they include boulders deposited during the last ice age. Native and naturalized vegetation can also contribute to a site's unique identity. And then, of course, if you're assessing existing neighborhood and community development patterns, can help you inform context-sensitive site planning and building design. Now, when you build this graphic board or neighborhood pattern book, it'll help you enable the design of new development that enhances the unique local character by repeating the best qualities of building and site design in that community and or geographic region. Now, public places are another form of cultural resource that should be considered in assessing a neighborhood and community context. Community assets that contribute to a neighborhood's character and sense of place include parks, schools, libraries, and community centers. Public open spaces can provide not only visual amenities and outdoor recreational opportunities, but also space for stormwater management and other functions of green infrastructure. Both indoor and outdoor places, privately owned but open to the public, perform a very important social function that help define the character of the place. Context-sensitive design or context-sensitive planning should also be responsive to the history and needs of a particular place and time. Depending on the age, quality, and role of these places in the local, regional, or national culture, some of these resources may have significant historic value. Cultural resource inventories should document the location, the quality, and historic significance of buildings and other human-made elements, as well as prior land use. So if your site doesn't exactly have any significant historic or cultural assets, you still need to consider previous land uses, just to be sure that you might need to treat the land or whatnot, especially if the land was previously industrial. So what can be considered as historic resources? They can be bridges, they can be buildings, walls, any kind of signs and other noteworthy structures or neighborhoods built in the previous eras. So historic resources or built historic resources can be single establishments such as these, or it can extend. Uh, it can be as large as a whole village or a whole settlement, like whole kampungs, for example. And how do we determine the historic significance? Well, the historic significance of a structure, the structure or an area can be based on criteria such as age, quality, rarity, and representativeness. So, how does it represent? Does it represent a certain culture and such? Historic districts, historic kampungs can be mapped by local planning agencies as a sort of zoning overlay districts with more restrictive development controls. Cultural resources also include historic sites, such as forts, perhaps even battlefields, parks, and other archaeological artifacts. Understanding a site's cultural and historic context also includes knowing something about the people who live in the neighborhood or around the neighborhood or in the immediate vicinity. Um, Depending on the type of planning and design project that is being considered, demographic data can be collected on a variety of household attributes like population density, population age and ethnicity, then household size, household income, and household composition and the like. Now, these and other attributes are commonly used in market studies to inform the programming of private and public sector projects. Um, Community level sustainability initiatives are also beginning to measure various social, economic, and environmental indicators for individual neighborhoods and districts. So basically understanding the society, understanding the society's structure, which you are currently learning in community development, can also help you understand how significant a site is and how people use a certain site prior to your development intervention. Sorry if my background is getting a bit noisy now. Now, from demographics, let's move on to a bit more intangible aspects, especially, and this one is about environmental perception. Now, when we talk about perception, there are many ways in which our knowledge, our experiences, and our values, our inherent values, influence our perceptions of lands, and landscapes, and everything else, basically. Each perspective is a product of the unique lens through which, to which each and every one of us view the world. You may have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, that suggests basic human needs must be satisfied before higher level secondary and tertiary needs can be satisfied. Now, interestingly, physical or physiological needs, or physical safety and security, along with food, clothing, and shelter they're the most basic needs in the hierarchy. However, the perceptions of safety and security vary among individuals, depending on their age, gender, health, and other attributes. So, um, what safety is and what physical comfort is for one person may differ to another. Now, our ability to see, to smell, to taste, touch, and hear also inform um, our, our perception and help us shape the perception of our surroundings. A sensory approach to environmental education, for example, is an effective way to help students understand cause and effect relationships between society and the environment. Again, using their senses, forming perceptions. For most people, perceptions of the built environment are formed primarily through the sense of sight. Um, Physical well being is linked to environmental quality. So, noise and air quality are also important factors, not just what we can see, but also what we can hear and what we can sense with our other senses, especially our nose. Um, Visual resource assessments for site planning purposes are usually concerned with visibility and visual quality, which we'll get into soon. Um, However, the significance of each attribute really depends on the context, of course, but also dependent on the intended uses of the site. Again, I can't stress this enough that context does play a very crucial role in project programming and site design. Land uses on adjoining sites, for example, can influence the suitability of a site for certain uses and use intensities. Good visibility to the site from adjacent streets and other off-site locations may reduce the site suitability for residential uses. Um, but good visibility to the site can enhance its suitability for commercial uses, thereby potentially increasing property values and business income. Certain types of residential development, however, may place a premium on privacy and screening from off-site locations. How a site will be used can also depend on what can be seen from the site. The visibility of off-site features can be as important as the visibility of on-site features. In urban environments, views from a site may be blocked by nearby buildings, but if the site is on a hill or a waterfront, then unobstructed off-site views can be dramatic. In rural environments, a site that is heavily forested yet relatively flat um, limits views on and off the site. Sorry. In contrast, in landscapes with long unobstructed views, as in mountainous terrains or the open plains, then the visible distance from the site can be very, very substantial. So, visual quality is influenced by distinctive biophysical and cultural features, which may include rock outcrops, water bodies, um, as well as stone wall and houses of worship. Uh, the type, abundance, and arrangement of these natural and built features influence the landscape's scenic quality, which can be assessed at the site as well as at regional scales. There are two approaches that have been used in assessing the visual quality of cultural landscapes. Um, the objectivist approach assumes that visual quality is an inherent landscape attribute, whereas subjectivists' approach assumes that visual quality is in the eyes of the beholder. Now, although it is true that conceptions of beauty are influenced by an observer's knowledge and experience and preferences, there is ample evidence to identify broadly accepted design principles for improving the visual quality of the built environment. Um, Aesthetic quality assessments by experts take into account an area's scenic qualities or visible attributes, which include form, proportion, line, color, texture. To help you with visual quality assessment, you can do participatory assessments that engages a representative of randomly selected or a group of individuals to provide their opinions on the visual quality of existing as well as proposed places within the built environment. Typically, visual preferences are elicited from for a carefully selected set of photographic scenes. Now, these visual preference surveys can be an effective tool for engaging the public in neighborhood planning decisions. So, determining the visual quality of a site and of the area surrounding a site doesn't fall on your shoulders entirely. You can conduct visual preference surveys to help you make your decisions and to help you assess the overall visual quality. Again, as visual quality is one of the many important factors in site planning and design. And the visual quality of the site itself, as well as the visible off-site features, can play key roles in the success of, for example, real estate development projects. Views to significant buildings, prominent mountains, and other landmarks, for example, convey a strong sense of place. Conversely, unobstructed views to a busy highway or to a large treeless parking lot or to an industrial site can be a liability that reduces the site's usability for certain purposes, especially residential development. So visibility and visual quality affect land use preferences and real estate values. And these attributes should be carefully considered in development planning and in design. Whether positive or negative, views and vistas are important to assess. At the landscape or even regional scale, a study area can be divided into a regular grid, with each grid cell rated for visual quality using one of four categorical, or this is not categorical, this is ordinal classes from a common, frequent to very unique. And the visual quality of smaller areas can also be mapped, although rather than using grid cell mapping units, individual buildings and outdoor spaces can be evaluated for the visual quality. The mapping units at these smaller scales need not to be uniform in either size or shape. It just needs to be representative. So, a site's suitability for its intended uses may be affected not only by what people can see on the site, but also what they can hear and what they can smell. Noise in the built environment varies on an hourly, daily, or seasonal basis and can have a significant impact on recreational experiences outdoors. Environmental perception has experiential implications in other settings. In urban environments, most parks, plazas, and other significant outdoor spaces can be considered successful from a design perspective when vehicles are minimized. That includes the absence of vehicle noise and traffic related air pollution. Noise can be described in terms of sound intensity, perceived as loudness, and frequency, perceived as pitch. Sound intensity is usually measured as sound pressure level or SPL on a logarithmic decibel scale or dBs. One thing to note about noise exposure is that the intensity and the duration of noise exposure determine the potential for damage to the inner ear. That's just something to consider. Um, trivial, trivial knowledge, permanent hearing loss can result from chronic noise exposures around 85 decibels or higher on average for an 8-hour period. However, experts say that 4 hours of noise exposure at 88 decibels provide the same noise uh, dose dosage as 8 hours at 85 decibels. So yeah, when you talk about public health or health implications in general, most of us, it's not most of us, it's easy for us to overlook things like the the health impacts of noise. It's easier for us to perceive um, because of because of our educational background and whatnot. Um, it's easier for us to perceive and comprehend air pollution and sometimes not really give it too much thought about noise. So um, that's all I have to say for today. However, next week I have planned a kind of simulation, uh, kind of site inventory simulation exercise for you guys to do. Um, as with other simulations, I will provide a simulation brief for you to read and for you to prepare. So maybe next week our meeting will be a bit shorter. It's more of a clarification of the brief of the inventory brief in hand. Is it group work or is it individual? It's more likely individual. So I'm going to keep the scale of inventory short and try to make it as or try to make it as less tedious as I can. So before we end, would you like, if anybody has any questions or comments regarding regarding the contents that I delivered today, you're more than welcome to do so.
Hello, sir. Morning.
Morning.
Hope you're fine. I have seen that the inventory aspect is kind of like complex. It involves a lot of things. Is it possible to like omit some of the things, or everything has to be considered from last week? What you explained and is it necessary to omit some of the things, or things that need to be considered, all the things. Thank you.
Okay, that's a very good question. I did over the course of these past 2 weeks present to you an extensive, if not exhaustive, list of things to consider. However, for the purpose of the simulation that we will do next week, and for the purpose of your task, um, you will need to or you can omit some aspects or some attributes um, from the extensive list that I mentioned. One of the reasons why I'm allowing you, or I'm giving you the permission to omit some attributes, is that some of these things is that time, of course, and that some of the things that I mentioned may need you may need assistance from technical experts to carry out your observations or inventory. Sorry. For example, when I talked about vegetation, and when you want to make a an inventory of the vegetation, right? When you're putting together an inventory of the plants and vegetations that are on your site, you may not need to go as far as identifying what species they are, and are they native to the area. Are they an exotic or invasive species to the area? You may just need to consider, or you're allowed to consider just, wait. Where was it? You are allowed to just consider the tree's dimensions, its size, its height, the diameter of its canopy, if you can. So just the size, and the condition of the trees is enough. If you have time, and the location, of course. If you have, if you're going to conduct a remote survey to do your inventory, then some of these attributes can be a bit problematic to identify. You may be able to predict the tree size from, say, Google Street View, but if that particular area doesn't have a Street View option to it, then you're stuck with an aerial photograph. So the only information you can get from the aerial photograph is the size of the cluster, how much area does it cover, and of course the location. It may be hard, if not impossible, to assess what species they are and how healthy they are, and so on. So with that in mind, you can omit some attributes. The most important part of the site planning task is actually the site itself. Was it 5 to 10 hectares, 5 to 10 hectares of land for you to play with, and that the area that you choose has a contour, has different has varied elevations, or is a contoured area. Um, whether it has certain types of vegetation or certain animal species and certain attributes like riverines and stuff, it's not it's not that sorry, it's not that crucial at this point. So yeah, even for the exercise that I'm planning, I'm going to omit I'm going to omit a lot of attributes because I assume I assume that most of you live in a heavily man-made or heavily built environment at the moment. So I'm just going to focus on the things that are observable from that kind of setting, and so keep the attributes or keep the stuff like vegetation and animals to a minimum. You can identify you can identify or you can spot a few animals uh, in and around where you live. Um, it may be you may be surprised that there's more than just mice, rats, and cockroaches, for example, around you. Uh, but I'm not going to I'm not going to force you to find out where where the sparrows that you see every now and then live, or if the pigeons if the pigeons are native or invasive species around your area. Um, Most likely the pigeons belong to your neighbor, for example. So yes, it is an exhaustive list, and yes, you can omit some items from the list, and yes, I will omit some items from the list. I'll just I'll just make sure I'll try to make sure that the the site inventory activity and the site inventory that you will need to use that you will need to conduct for your group task is to the bare minimum. So I hope that I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you, sir. It has really answered my question. You have actually answered my questions. Thank you.
Great. Um, Sorry for scaring you with this exhaustive list, but in professional practice, you will need to consider a lot, um, everything on the list that I've mentioned, and then some, perhaps. Um, but you will because site planning and development is a major undertaking. You're not going to do it by yourself, and you'll most likely be working with a team of people with different expertise. You'll be talking. You'll be working with people with a geographical background, with an architectural background, with a landscape design background, or um, maybe archaeologists and historians and and biologists and conservationists, depending on the project that you're working on, depending on the project and the location that you're working on. So um, I'm just introducing the items to you right now, just to demonstrate to demonstrate the extensiveness and the interconnectivity of the different elements, of the different components within a given site, and the possibilities of different types of interactions within a given site. Hopefully, I've done that. So, yeah, hopefully I've done that. But not. Hopefully, I didn't scare you off your task, because you might be thinking, holy crap, I'm going to have to do all of this. No, you don't have to do all of this. If that makes you all feel better. So, any other questions or comments? Or maybe I should ask Pak Frendika to give us a couple of words or comments, and if he may.
Thank you, Pak Nanda. Hello, everyone. Good morning. I just want to say that I really enjoy your explanation, Pak Nanda. I think all the students have holistically perspective about the site inventory in I think in physical aspect, biological aspect, and cultural aspect. I think it's very interesting to know that it is a very huge aspects that we have to consider before we design or we plan our site. I think itu Ananda. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, and thank you for finding the presentation enjoyable. Although, it felt rather, to me at least, it felt rather extensive and a bit tedious. But anyways, thank you for that. Well, if nobody else has any questions or comments, I will let you know of the exercise brief a little closer to the day. So next week you guys will have two simulations: the community mapping simulation and the site inventory exercise. So goody. Well, I think and on that note, I think we can end today's session. Thank you all for coming. Don't forget to mark your attendance. Hang on, I'll just. It's responding very slowly. I'll just bring up the QR code and the attendance code again, 733-523. Oh, nice, it rhymes. For you all to mark your attendance if you haven't done so. Otherwise, thank you all for coming and joining me on this very bright day, very bright morning. And I look forward to seeing you all again next week. So have a great day to you all. If we don't see each other before Friday, I wish you all a happy Easter, especially for those of you celebrating the holidays. And thank you again. See you all next week.
Thank you. Thank you, Pak Nanda.
Thank you, sir.